thank you so much, everyone, for coming to this session on Existence is Resistance, History of the Palestinian Struggle. It's really fantastic to see you all here. I'll remember to introduce myself. I'm Ellie Babcock, Counterfire member, and I'll be chairing this session. We have two fantastic speakers today I'm really looking forward to hearing from. We have Michael Lavalette, who's a long-term activist and author of Palestinian Cultures of Resistance. That's his most recent book, which is out now, and I think there'll be a link to that in the chat. And we also are joined by Leanne Mohamad, who's a British Palestinian human rights activist, public speaker, and spoken word artist, and I'm really looking forward to hearing her insights on the history of the Palestinian struggle. So each speaker will speak for about 15 minutes, and then we'll have lots of time for questions and contributions after that. So without any further ado, if I can introduce Leanne, then we'll start off with you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ellie, for that introduction. I just want to start off by saying thank you to everyone tuning in to this very important discussion today. Thank you to Counterfire for organising. It's an honour to be able to address you all, and of course to be speaking alongside Michael as well. Today, before we go into speaking more about the current events happening in Palestine and about how we can come together to collectively play a part and make a difference, I'd like to start off by telling you a bit more about my story and a bit about my Palestinian family background and why I'm here today, still speaking up, still resisting, and still fighting for freedom and the right of return. So my name is Leanne Mohamad. I am a 20-year-old British Palestinian, born and raised in London. Some of you may recognise me as the girl who spoke out and was silenced, or the girl who was censored for hoping for freedom. So it's now been 5 years since my activism journey began at the age of 15, when I was nominated by my English teacher to take part in the Jack Petrie Speak Out Challenge, the largest speaking competition for young people in the world, in which I chose to talk about something that I truly had a passion for, Palestine. And so I submitted a speech titled Birds Not Bombs, and it won with applause and without any objection from my audience. Personally, my aim was to spread the message of the reality of Palestine and the hardships that my people face on a day-to-day basis. Now, after winning the regional Speak Out competition, I was extremely proud of my achievement. But after my video had gone viral, this happy moment was then hijacked by online trolls who were out there to discredit me. They bombarded my school Twitter, which had to be shut down. They then went online and created videos and labelled me as the good little ISIS girl. And so I was subjected to a barrage of online abusive comments, as well as online videos, referring to me as a 15-year-old suicide bomber, an ISIS recruiter, an evil anti-Semitic Nazi schoolgirl, and believe me, the list goes on. This further became a police matter, and although all the advice was to simply just shut my Twitter down, I was not ready to lose. With pain comes learning, and with the support of my family and my friends, I rose to the challenge. I was determined not to fall. They were not going to win, and it's proved that they helped me to be heard as far and beyond as I could imagine. So I thank them, and they can call me what they want, but I will never act like there is nothing going on. Something I've said before, and what I will continue to stick by, is that no one will ever silence me, and I will continue to shout louder about the plight of my people. So that is a bit about my story and a bit about how I am still resisting to this day, because they try to silence us and they will continue to try to silence us, but we must not be silent. And that is exactly what I've been doing till this very day. Here I am 5 years later, continuing my journey of activism, because Palestine is not a trend. Palestine is not a trend, and our solidarity movement is not a trend, but it is a continuous fight until justice prevails. Now, recently, on the 15th of May this year, we marked 73 years of the Palestinian Nakba, our ongoing catastrophe, the day where 750,000 Palestinians were forced and driven out of Palestine by the Zionist Israeli occupation, when over 500 towns and cities were completely depopulated, and when Palestinian refugees were left with only what they could carry on their backs. The Nakba is my family's story. The story of when my grandparents were forced and driven out of their home in Haifa, in Palestine, by the Zionist Israeli occupation, and ended up as refugees in Lebanon. What we are currently witnessing in Palestine right now, and what we've been witnessing recently, is exactly what my grandparents had to endure exactly 73 years ago. The Nakba was not just a one-off event of expulsion, but an ongoing process. an ongoing process of racism, settler colonialism, land theft, genocidal massacres, occupation, and dehumanization. These are my grandparents' lived experiences, and there is not one Palestinian alive today who has not been directly affected by the Nakba. Because the Nakba is our open wounds that did not heal, that is still bleeding. And Palestinians have been living under the biggest social injustice of our time since the Nakba. The Nakba is that catastrophe that built the path for the dispossession of Palestinians, that led to the altar of many Palestinian family destinies, and that created the world's longest running refugee population. Now, if we look at the 15th of May, 2021, the day where 73 years of genocide continues, marking 73 years of dispossession, forced exile, and oppression. Israel has continued this settler colonial project, and today, in 2021, Sheikh Jarrah, Silwan, and Lifta are the latest neighbourhoods facing evictions, all to make way for Israeli settlers to take over, whom are illegal under international law. This is the ongoing forced displacement and violent dispossession faced by Palestinians for over 73 years. Now, as a third-generation Palestinian still being affected by the Nakba, this sits so heavy on my heart, and I can't even express how it feels. To be a Palestinian, daughter of a refugee, and someone who hasn't even visited Palestine, when Palestine is my country, my land, and my home. I pray that, and I believe that we are the generation that will be able to gift our grandparents a free Palestine and their right to return home. And I yearn for that day, and I live for that day, and I will continue doing this till I see that day, until I see justice for all Palestinians. Palestinians who are still occupied, still violently forced from their land, and who are still awaiting their right of return. So there was no end to the 1948 Nakba, but there was the Neksa, the setback and the continuation of what we are still seeing today. The continuation of apartheid, of home demolitions, of land confiscations, of illegal settlements, the continuation of war crimes, detentions, restrictions, unlawful killings, and still the continuation of no accountability. But we will not stand for the normalization of human rights abuses, of apartheid policies, and of continuous violations of international law. Just because there has recently been a ceasefire does not mean that our Palestinian tragedy has ended. Israel's illegal military occupation and the Gaza blockade has not been lifted. There are still Palestinian children detained in Israeli jails. Illegal settlements have not been removed. Israel's apartheid wall has not fallen. Palestine is still colonized. Violence is more than bombs, rockets, and airstrikes. Israel's violence does not just end with a ceasefire. Being a Palestinian means that you wake up daily to more dehumanization and oppression, and you are born with generations of trauma, killed daily in both physical and metaphorical ways, and the cycle of violence is endless. Now, I feel the weight of the Palestinian cause on my chest, the injustice, the oppression, and the anger, and it's a weight and feeling that I'll carry with me until the day that justice prevails. Palestine is my country, my land, and my home. Their pain is my pain, and their freedom is my freedom. And I think what's really important to mention here and to highlight is that what we are dealing with here is not an ethnic or a religious struggle. This is an anti-racist, anti-colonialist humanitarian struggle. And this is the struggle that every human can and must support. There is only the colonizer and the colonized, the displacing and the displaced, and the oppressor and the oppressed. Their battle is our battle, and we cannot let them go through it alone. Together, our numbers make us stronger, our evidence makes us wiser, but our partnership is really what makes us more powerful. We should never be afraid to raise our voices for honesty, truth, and compassion against injustice, lying, and greed. That is why we must continue the fight. We must continue boycotting, protesting, and educating, and unapologetically continue to speak out until they have justice. Believe me, they see the strength in this future resistance, and they try to break us down. They feel threatened by us. They try to dampen the Palestinian spirit of resistance, but let us tell them they will only make us stronger. We clearly saw how they are detaining journalists, how they try to silence Muna and Mohamad al-Kurd from Sheikh Jarrah. We can see their tactics, and this is their only tool, intimidation. Whereas for us, the facts, the history, the truth, the evidence, it's all on our side. That is why our generation will be the one to dismantle the system of oppression. We must insist to continue our path of resistance, supporting the oppressed and never the oppressors. No matter who goes against us, no matter how much they try to erase us from this earth, no matter what they do, Palestine will always exist so as long as we continue to resist. So if you're watching this today and you want to do something, you want to help and you want to be a part of this bigger change, it's never too late to start now. Believe me, whatever we take up and start today will impact change for tomorrow. Resistance is now not a choice, but in fact, it's an obligation, because none of us are free until all of us are free. So what can you do? If you ask me, I'll tell you, keep posting on social media. We need to keep Palestine viral. We need to keep amplifying Palestinian voices, keep boycotting Israeli products, boycott companies complicit in these human rights violations. Call on your representatives, your MPs, to speak up and act now. Continue lobbying, sign petitions, join your Palestine Society if you're at university. If there ain't one, create one, organize, keep pushing, just keep the conversation going. Wake up, speak up, and let's stand as one. Because in the end, one voice can make a difference, but all our voices combined can make a change. Now is really the time to mobilize, to be louder than we have ever been. So if you ask me how long this oppression and this occupation will last, my answer to you is in our hands collectively. This is the time to be louder than we have ever been, to take action like we've never taken action before. So I urge all of you to take a stance, to carry on standing up for Palestine. Please don't be silent. Please carry on speaking up for Palestine. Keep Palestine viral. Let's all continue to raise our voices for a free Palestine, because it is free Palestine until Palestine is free. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Leanne. That was so moving and just really motivating and inspirational. Yeah, and you know, I'm sure that everyone will be out on the streets, you know, for the next Palestine protests and keeping that at the forefront of their minds. So thank you so much for sharing your experiences. I'll now introduce Michael, who will speak for about 15 minutes as well.
Okay, thanks very much. And it's great to be speaking alongside Leanne, but it's also quite difficult to follow Leanne, the passion that she showed there, and so she set the bar very, very high. Leanne and myself had a talk on Friday, and we decided that what we were going to do in terms of dividing our speeches up was that Leanne was going to talk a little bit about her own personal experience, but also the reality of dispossession and oppression. And I think what she embodies really is that Palestinian word samud of resilience and resistance, and I suppose a more colloquial translation of that would be just the bloody mindedness of the Palestinians, that they will not be moved, that this is their struggle, and that no matter how long this continues, they will continue to fight. But what we also thought that we wanted to do as well was to place within that the various different phases of the Palestinian resistance movement, to think about, you know, the various phases that's gone through and what we can learn the lessons at, and where we might be taking or where that might go next. So what I'm going to do over the next 15 minutes is really divide that into 5 phases, starting in 1948 when Leanne's story started. And I want us to think back to 1948 because the impact of the Nakba was huge on those Palestinian communities in 2 ways. There was those who'd been expelled and found themselves in refugee camps in Lebanon or in Syria or in Jordan, and faced, you might think would be welcomed in the Arab world, but actually faced all sorts of barriers in those countries, faced poverty, faced difficulties getting jobs and all that. And there was also those Palestinians who were left behind in what became Israel, but what I'm going to call Palestine 48. And actually for both, whether you were one of the expelled or one of the left behind, your life was dramatically impacted by the Nakba. For the Palestinians in 48, they were subject to military orders which were put in place by the British during the Mandate era, especially during the Great Revolt in 1936-1939 revolt, when the Palestinians rose up against the British in the most significant rebellion against British imperialism in the interwar years. And the British brought in a whole series of regulations to control Palestinians at that time. And Palestinians left in Palestine 48 were subject to those rules right up until 1967. So that meant it was difficult to move from village to village without a passport in Palestine 48. It meant there was very little publications or any books published in Arabic, between 1948 and 1967, there was only 63 books published in Arabic, and most of those were published for Jewish citizens who were Arab speakers, not for Palestinian Arab speakers in that way. So they were cut off from newspapers, they were cut off from the Arab world and the rest of the world because of the settlement. They were subject to harsh military orders. And those who were in the refugee camps were the dispossessed, were in poverty, were facing all sorts of barriers in the countries that they came from. And so it was difficult to think about forms of resistance in that way. And the dominant ideas of Palestinian resistance in this first phase, from about 48 through to about 1967, were shaped around the ideas of pan-Arabism. And the idea was that the liberation of Palestine and the right of return of the Palestinian refugees would be brought about through a conventional war in which particularly Egypt under Gamal Abdel Nasser, but also Syria and Jordan would be the armies that would confront Israel, defeat Israel, and allow the Palestinians to return. And so, if you like, the dominant trend was to look for agency outside of Palestine itself. The main Palestinian organisations, Fatah isn't formed until 1959. The PLO isn't formed until 1964, and in 1964 it's under Egyptian control. And so, you know, that there aren't those so that most people looking for liberation tend to look at those pan-Arabist solutions. And pan-Arabism in the form of Nasser was wrapped up in a sort of a claim of a sort of Arab socialism. So Nasser had nationalised the Suez Canal, there was some land reform, so there was a notion that this would be a better world and a liberation on the back of those armed forces. That comes to a crashing halt in 1967 in the Naksa, as Leanne mentioned the Naksa, because the Naksa was the was the 6-day war. And in 6 days, the Israeli forces defeat the combined forces of Egypt and take the Gaza and the Sinai, of Jordan and take the West Bank, and Syria and take the Golan Heights. So any notion that you were waiting on the large armed forces of those countries to liberate you was completely torn asunder by the reality of the Israelis winning that war in 6 days. And so the second phase is really between about 1967 and 1982. And this is the rise of the Fedayeen, the rise of the armed fighters, the rise of the Liberation Revolutionary War and the armed struggle for liberation. The roots of that were, as I mentioned, Fatah was formed in 59. Fatah started their first armed insurrection, or their first armed movement in Israel in 1964. But the real turning point for the Fedayeen movement was in 1968. So after the 6-day war, the Fedayeen and the resistance movements moved from the West Bank and located themselves in Jordan. And their main village was a place called Karama in the Jordan Valley. And in 1968, the Israelis were on the border of Jordan and Israel, and had decided that they were going to move against the Fedayeen, who were continuing to, in their terms, incurse into Israel and carry out small actions. So the Israelis put their armed forces on the border. The Jordanian state get wind of this, and the Jordanian state go to the guerrilla forces in Karama village and basically tell them that they have to flee because the Israelis are coming for them. And the two main organisations at this point are the PFLP, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, and they half leave, so they leave the village, but they go into the mountains round about. And Fatah, the largest of the organisations, who refused to move from Karama itself. And there's a famous speech, or at least apocryphal speech, that Arafat gives at that point, in which Arafat says to the fighters of Fatah, "We have given up, we are not moving, we are not running anymore. And in Karama, we will not concede a single grain of sand to the Israelis." And so Fatah forces stand in Karama. The Jordanian army enters into a sort of bombardment against the Israelis. Israeli paratroopers come to the mountains where they are confronted by the PFLP. The main forces attack Karama village, and about 90 Palestinian fighters are killed. 60 Israeli soldiers are killed, but then the Israelis leave the battlefield and their burnt out tanks are left across Jordan. And it is a huge ideological victory for the Fedayeen. After 67 and the 6-day war, here are the Fedayeen who have defeated the might of Israel. So ideologically, it was really, really important. And in the year after that, literally tens of thousands of people from the camps across Jordan and Syria and Lebanon, but also Egyptians and Lebanese who want to align with the Palestinian struggle, join the Fedayeen. And Fatah grows to be the main organisation by some considerable number, but the PFLP also grow, and some of the other organisations there. The growth of the Fedayeen therefore takes this into a second phase. There's the armed struggle for national liberation. But the growth of the Fedayeen also exposes fissures with the Arab states. And so the Fedayeen also find themselves in conflict with Jordan. And in September 1970, and what's called Black September, the Jordanian government moved against the Palestinian Fedayeen, and the Fedayeen therefore are expelled from Jordan and end up in Beirut. And in Beirut, there are tensions in Beirut between the various different forces because of the way in which Beirut was constructed by the French and the sectorial divisions that the French had put in there in the interwar period. The Fedayeen grow, Beirut is their centre, and from Beirut they launch various military campaigns against Israel. But the next turning point in that really is in 1978, because in 1978, the first of the Egyptian states make an agreement with Israel. So in Camp David, Egypt recognises Israel, and again, it's a huge setback for those who look towards some sort of government or nation state solution to that. But rather than bringing peace, that just gave the Israelis further succor to increase their attacks on the Fedayeen. And these really come to a head in 1982. In 1982, in something that the Israelis call Peace in the Galilee, they launch a war against the Fedayeen in Lebanon. And in 7 days, they sweep from Israel right up to Beirut, and it looks as if they are going to smash the PLO, smash the Fedayeen, and drive them into the Mediterranean. Except that when they get to the grounds of Beirut, the Fedayeen fight the most heroic resistance battle, which lasts for 7 weeks. So for 7 weeks, there are ground, sea, and air attacks on the Fedayeen. And at the end, there is a negotiated settlement. So the Americans bring in a negotiated settlement. Actually, the Fedayeen, or many sections of the Fedayeen, didn't want a negotiated settlement, thought they could push the Israelis back, but Arafat accepted that there should be a negotiated settlement.
You've got about 5 minutes left, Michael.
Thanks, Ellie. That negotiated settlement scattered the Palestinian fighters across the Arab world. They left Beirut. And the final episode of that was that as they left Beirut, they left the refugee camps unarmed. And the Lebanese Phalange, the fascist forces of the Phalange, under cover of the Israelis, moved into the 2 refugee camps in Sabra and Shatila and carried out the most atrocious murderous few nights in those camps. You want to just reading some of the events that happened in those few days. This was a catastrophic defeat for the Fedayeen and for the PLO. Their fighting forces were scattered over the Arab world, and also in the camps, there was a notion that they had abandoned the people in the camps themselves. So much so that for the next 2 years, the Arab League annual meetings, Palestine was just pushed back to being the final item on the appendix. It wasn't the first item to be talked about. It had been moved to being a minor interest for the other Arab states. And there was a massive crisis for the PLO over what was going to do about how we take the struggle forward. But the next phase of the struggle, the most interesting phase of the struggle, I think, is what happened between 1987 and 1993. Because the rebirth of the Palestinian struggle didn't come through the official PLO organisations. It came through the First Intifada. And the First Intifada, which started in Gaza, which spread through Palestine 48, which went through the West Bank, was a truly mass movement of the Palestinian people in the whole of Palestine 48. There were mass strikes, there was mass demonstrations, there were alternative schooling and education systems set up, there was alternative health and welfare systems set up, and the Israeli state responded brutally. Nevertheless, because of the scale of that, it brought the Palestinians to the negotiating tables, and one of the consequences of the First Intifada was the Oslo Accords and the recognition that the Palestinian Authority would be set up. So it was a mass movement. It didn't involve just fighters. It involved old and young, men and women. It involved civil society organisations. Many of the legacy of those civil society organisations can still be found in the refugee camps today, and the youth organisations and the Janine Freedom Theatre movement that we heard about last night. All those things have their roots in the First Intifada and the mass movement against Israel that took place in that time. We then get the establishment of the Palestinian Authority. There's a relative period of calm for a couple of years, but then in 2000 there is the Second Intifada. And some people say, well, the First Intifada and the Second Intifada were the same. They weren't. The Second Intifada was a highly militarized event on both sides. In the first 5 days of the Second Intifada, the Israeli forces fired off 1 billion bullets. Just the scale of that is absolutely frightening. It was a highly militarized event, and because it was militarized on both sides, it meant that the armed forces on the Palestinian side had to be small units of fighters, overwhelmingly men rather than women, in contrast to the First Intifada, which was men and women in their masses. And it tended to be young people who were going to fight in that way as well. So the form of the struggle shaped who was involved in those ways. And the Second Intifada, again, was put down with the most brutal activities by the Israelis in places like Jenin, in places like Nablus, in places like Hebron. The assaults on the Palestinian community was just unbelievable. And then the end of the Second Intifada brings us, really 2005 brings us up to date. And so what we've had in the last period is a series of Israeli attacks primarily on Gaza, as a proxy to try and, that horrible phrase of mowing the lawn, where they regularly attack Gaza and take out some of the opposition forces there. But not the same level of attack on the West Bank. Of course, you have the settlers and the settler movement, but there has been the reliance of the Palestinian authorities to try and keep a lid on the Palestinian resistance movement in the West Bank. So what does this take us to today? First of all, I think the events of the last few months have been really interesting, because for the first time since the mid-1980s, we saw the resistance movement of the last few months not simply being in Gaza, or not simply being in Gaza in the West Bank, but it also spread through Palestine 48 and exposed those problems and those difficulties of controlling the Palestinian resistance for the Israelis. And the final thing to say is, as Leanne touched upon, is that also brought in a deeper connection with the international movement. I started my campaigning around Palestine in 1982, at the time of that of the siege of Beirut, when I was in Glasgow University, when we tried to twin Glasgow University with Birzeit University in the West Bank. And at that point, we were a tiny minority of a movement. It was all over the front of the Scottish newspapers. It was, oh my goodness, what are Glasgow University students doing? This is horrific. If you contrast that with the biggest demonstrations in support of Palestine, then we have come a huge way. This is now an incredibly popular demand for Palestine liberation. We are part of a global movement. And our responsibility is to make sure that we are raising that argument in our country, in Britain, that we're part of an international movement to enforce BDS, that we're offering solidarity to the Palestinians whenever and whenever they rise up against the Israelis, and that we are part of an international movement that, as Leanne said, I feel is closer to the victory than we've been for many a year.